I just came from the Rules Committee hearing on the Corrupt Politicians Act. This is the most dangerous legislation that's ever been considered by the Rules Committee. It is in the House H.R. 1, it is in the Senate S.1. That means it's the very first bill that was submitted by Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats, the very first bill that was submitted by Chuck Schumer and the Democrats. It is their number one priority. Pause for a minute and reflect that the top priority of the Democrats is not COVID-19. It's not immunizations. It's not getting people back to work. It's not reopening schools and getting millions of kids back in the classroom. It is locking in power for the Democrats for the next 100 years. That is their overarching priority. How does it do this? The Corrupt Politicians Act mandates automatic voter registration whenever anyone has an interaction with the government, whether they have an interaction getting a welfare check, an unemployment check, whether they have a driver's license from the DMV, whether they attend a public university, everyone is registered. This bill is intended to and will register to vote millions of illegal aliens. That is exactly what the Democrats want to do with this bill, is register millions of illegal aliens. And the text of the bill acknowledges that, and it says the illegal aliens who are registered to vote, even though it's against the law for them to vote, they face no liability because they're automatically registered to vote. Not only that, this bill prevents the states from addressing that, from correcting the voter rolls, prevents the states from removing dead people from the voter rolls to facilitate voter fraud. Not only that, this bill mandates that criminals be allowed to vote, that all felons. Many states have very reasonable laws that prohibit felons from voting. The Democrats repeal every one of those laws. They mandate that murderers, that rapists, that child molesters be allowed to vote. Now, the reason the Democrats do that is they've made the determination that if millions of illegal aliens and millions of criminals are allowed to vote, that those voters are going to vote for Democrats, and they're going to keep Democrats in power forever. Beyond that, this bill strikes down the election integrity laws at the state level across the board. Photo ID laws, voter identification laws. 29 states have voter identification laws. By the way, about 80% of Americans support voter identification laws. The Corrupt Politicians Act strikes every one of those down. Among the states that have voter identification laws are Georgia, Arizona, and West Virginia. All three of those states have Democratic senators in this body. Those Democratic senators are saying to their states they're willing to strike down the voter identification laws that were adopted in those states. This bill mandates ballot harvesting, paid operatives from the Democratic National Committee collecting votes, going to a nursing home, collecting hundreds of votes, potentially throwing out the votes they don't like. It is an invitation to corruption. You know, in 2005, the Carter-Baker Commission was chaired by Democratic President Jimmy Carter, by Republican former Secretary of State James Baker, concluded that ballot harvesting poses a serious risk of voter fraud. So what does the Corrupt Politicians Act do? It incorporates it. Beyond that, this bill is also welfare for politicians. It provides a 6-to-1 match, federal taxpayer dollars going to politicians to fund their campaigns, hundreds of millions of dollars of federal money going to fund campaigns. And you know what this bill also says? The corrupt politicians can pay themselves a salary from the money from the federal government while they're running for office. This bill is of the Democrats, by the Democrats, and for the Democrats. It is designed to keep them in power. And a final point. For 50 years, the Federal Election Commission has been bipartisan. 3 Republicans, 3 Democrats. That has ensured some modicum of fairness. What does this bill do? It turns the Federal Election Commission into a partisan attack machine. Ask yourself right now, if Democrats have control of the Federal Election Commission, if Chuck Schumer is in charge of elections, you have Republican senators here. I can guarantee you every Republican senator is getting fined by the Chuck Schumer Federal Election Commission. Every Republican senator is getting sued by the Chuck Schumer Federal Election Commission. Every Republican senator is getting targeted. Why? This is not remotely an election integrity bill. This is a bill designed to steal your vote, to take it away and to give it to millions of illegal immigrants and criminals and it is a fundamental threat to our democracy.
Ahead of tomorrow's meeting with the big tech leaders, what do you think of Zuckerberg's proposal to reform Section 230, make protections conditional based on whether the system...
I'm happy to answer that elsewhere, but let's keep the topics of the questions on the border visit and the press being blocked out.
There was that group of Republicans in the House that introduced a measure that would add some measures for border security that would also create a path to citizenship for people who were in this country illegally. Is that something that any of you would support?
Now, look, I'm sure that there will be ongoing debates about what to do concerning immigration. What we know for sure what not to do is what the Biden administration is doing now. It is an absolute crisis and disaster. No state is impacted more than my own state. The Biden administration is releasing illegal immigrants into Texas, is setting up detention facilities in Dallas, the convention center in downtown Dallas, is setting up detention facilities in Midland, Texas, against the wishes of the community. And they're releasing people who are criminal threats, who have criminal histories. They're releasing people who are testing positive for COVID. And they're not testing all the people they're releasing. And it is a public health threat. And the Biden administration refuses to acknowledge it and is trying to cover it up. There is a reason they don't want the press there. And I ask all of you to think for a moment how you would react, how your network would react, how MSNBC would react if the Trump administration said, no press at the border. You would have lost your mind. You would have lit your hair on fire and been screaming on air all day long. That's what Joe Biden is doing to you right now. And he's doing it because he's terrified of people seeing the inhumane conditions, seeing the human tragedies. And I've been down to the border many times, seeing the little boys and little girls that are being physically assaulted, that are being sexually assaulted, that the reports are packed so closely that the kids are having to sleep on their sides in the midst of a pandemic. Joe Biden doesn't want the American people to see that. The purpose of this trip is to help the American people understand the tragedy that's unfolding. Yeah.
On the asylum component, do you think that there should still be an option for people to apply for asylum at the border?
So there is, and we had actually one of the biggest victories, a foreign policy victory and an immigration victory under the Trump administration, what was called the Remain in Mexico policy, which is an agreement that was negotiated with Mexico. The vast majority of illegal immigrants coming to this country right now are not from Mexico. They're not Mexicans. A great many of them are Central Americans who are crossing illegally into Mexico, traveling through Mexico, and then trying to cross illegally into the United States. And what the Trump administration negotiated with the Mexican government is that if you had an illegal immigrant who was applying for asylum, that asylum claim could proceed, but that they would remain in Mexico while the claim was proceeding. And that resulted in a precipitous decline in illegal immigration. When Joe Biden got elected president, one of the very first things he did was rip up that international agreement, just effectively threw it in the trash. And as a result, we're bringing all those folks here, even though they're testing positive for COVID at a much, much higher rate than the U.S. population, and it is irresponsible. It doesn't make sense. The Remain in Mexico policy was a sound and reasonable policy that allowed the asylum process to move forward without encouraging illegal immigration. Anyone else?
Real quick.
Yeah.
I don't know the exact figure today, but a very high percentage of asylum claims are denied. And the reason we had this flood is because we had set such a low bar on an asylum claim based on credible fear that people coming would just be let in the country and their claim would never really be adjudicated. It'd go on for years. So it's a huge incentive for people to come. What's so sad about the current situation is President Trump, with those agreements in Central America with the MPP program, have pretty well solved the problem, stopped the flow of family units and unaccompanied children that were exploiting that asylum law. And then President Biden just blew that all up. We're also well on our way to fixing this issue of single adults as well by completing the fence, the wall. We have 250 miles yet to go, and it's basically paid for. We're going to be paying the money whether we build it or not, and he stopped building that wall as well. So again, we were so close, and this kind of gets to the other gentleman's question. We want to solve the problem, but you have to start with securing the border. And under the Trump administration, we were so close to accomplishing that, and that's all been blown up right now. And we are back to not only square one, we are so far behind where we were even under the Obama administration. It's just a tragedy. Just a tragedy.
The Biden administration says that the asylum process was completely dismantled under the Trump administration. So, with that said, how should this asylum process be rebuilt other than remain in Mexico? Should there be any sort of asylum? How many asylum seekers should be left?
So under Obama, they develop a process, and this is what they're talking about, of apprehending. They don't even have to try and catch because people turn themselves in. They apprehend, they process, and they disperse, which is a huge incentive for more people to come in, get apprehended, processed, and dispersed. That's what President Trump stopped in order to solve the problem of people exploiting our laws. That is exactly what they're complaining about was dismantled. That's what we had to dismantle to solve the problem.
Can I follow up on that? To the idea of, Democrats, I think, would argue that President Trump didn't solve the problem, he just moved it to the other side of the border, right? I mean, you've got people remaining in Mexico. I don't have to tell you, I mean, Ciudad Juarez is one of the most dangerous cities on the planet. So are you comfortable with the humanitarian implications of saying, you know, you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here?
So one of the things Democrats don't seem to understand is the concept of incentives. In 2011, there were roughly 6,000 unaccompanied children who crossed illegally into this country. Then President Obama signed DACA, signed executive amnesty directed at kids. The predictable effect, if you tell people you get amnesty if you come to this country illegally as a kid, is that a lot more kids will come to this country illegally. And as a result of that illegal and unconstitutional executive amnesty, that number 6,000 skyrocketed the next year to 93,000. In 2014, I visited the cages that were holding kids that were built by Barack Obama. It was Barack Obama who built the cages. And I remember visiting with HHS officials in the Obama administration who described children that were coming over and the cartels that were bringing them in. The cartel members were putting guns to the heads of kids and forcing kids to cut off the fingers or ears of other children. And what the cartels would do then is send those fingers and ears to the parents and extract a few thousand more dollars for their child that they had handed over to the human smuggler to take to America. And the Obama HHS described to me how they were facing, number one, kids that were horribly mutilated, missing fingers, missing ears, but number two, kids that were facing the psychological trauma of being forced to do that upon threat of death. Right now, the Biden DHS is predicting over 100,000 children. It is not humane, it is not compassionate to have a system that incentivizes and causes more little boys, more little girls to